There have been an onslaught of videos talking about the death of epic fantasy itself across booktube, and I will leave a bunch linked down in the description, so if you are interested to hear more takes on this topic, please go check them out, because I'm going to try and not just repeat what's already been said. So the question is epic fantasy really dying? And for this, we have to go to the question itself. First of all, epic fantasy. Genres came about as a way to classify different branches of narrative and break them up for a marketing standpoint. So if you enjoyed this book, you should come to our shop and buy a similar book. If you like this one, read this one. However, as genre bloomed outward and we got new different branches of genres, we started getting subgenres: grimdark fantasy, low fantasy, high fantasy, epic fantasy, lit RPG, progression fantasy. There's so many fantasies. But if we look at the subgenres, there isn't set definitions for each one. There are certainly indicators. If it's low fantasy, it means there's probably not magic and dragons. Or if they are, they don't show up as much and they're more of an animal than it is a more magical creature. And if you take something like grimdark, what is grimdark to one reader is not necessarily grimdark to another. It is just kind of this varying scale compared to what you consider falls under that certain category. Is it dark enough to be considered grimdark? Who knows? It depends what else you've read and what you consider the threshold to be considered grimdark instead of just a dark fantasy book. And epic fantasy is very much in the same vein. And what I would consider epic fantasy is just fantasy at an epic scale. So it becomes very difficult to then group in what is and isn't epic fantasy for different readers. It will be very varied compared to who you speak to. For example, if we look at The Hobbit is a very short novel, and it mainly focuses on going and getting this mountain back for the dwarves. Is that an epic scale? Does that considered an epic scale? And also there is the question of, would you then take into consideration the rest of the Middle-earth mythology? Because there is a certain implied depth to The Hobbit just on different references to different parts of the world, and if you know of the other works, you know there is that lore behind it as well. So does it count as epic fantasy? It's got all the world building. But I've also heard that epic fantasy needs to be a grand epic scale over a long period of time, so there has to be several books. Usually most people say above a quartet, so 5+ books, or they need to be 1,000 page long chonkers like Stormlight. And another thing to mention is then a mixing of subgenres. Like if it is very epic fantasy with several books, very long books, lots of world building, but it's also a murder mystery, does that count as epic fantasy, or is it just a murder mystery? Or even romantasy. If it's a romantasy but has epic fantasy elements, it's got large scale wars and it takes over a long period of time, it has lots of world building, it still counts as epic fantasy as well as romantasy. And I do think as time goes on and the fantasy genre continues to expand and branch out and we get a lot more new and different ideas, it will become harder and harder to then nail them down into these categories. Even Daniel Green recently put up a video talking about his top 10 speculative fiction books, because he said himself how hard it is to put some of these books into even just the fantasy and sci-fi genre, much less these subgenres. However, going back to the topic, the main focus of these other videos that I've seen on booktube are mainly for long epic fantasy series. So that's what we're going to continue on with this video with. It's a very specific type of epic fantasy. So is epic fantasy dying? No. Next up is looking back at the question and looking at the word dying. Now dying, it has a permanency to it. If you're dead, there's no coming back. And even the other booktubers who have done videos on this topic have all said, even if they do think epic fantasy is dying, that it is likely to have a resurgence. And because of this, I do think that the question itself is easy to misunderstand. Is it the end of epic fantasy? No, most definitely not. There's always going to be an audience for epic fantasy, and epic fantasy books will continue to be released. However, are we moving into a trend of having more shorter fantasy books and less really long fantasy epics? Possibly. So really going back to the question, it should really be, is long epic fantasy series going out of fashion for now? You can see why they didn't title the videos that. It's not particularly eye-catching question, but I do think that's probably more apt to what we're discussing in this topic. Now, in the other videos, they have mentioned talking with authors and hearing that there is more of a trend for shorter fantasy books. However, I have also heard from industry professionals and people who are currently taking submissions that this isn't the case. So what can you take away from this? Some authors are saying that is the case, some aren't. It's very difficult to come to the conclusion of this without having lots of insider information. There's lots of different publishing houses. They're all going to have their own ideas of what they're currently taking for submissions. So instead of that, let's ask the question, why would publishers prefer shorter series or shorter fantasy novels? Now, there are a number of reasons why this is better for money-making side of the business, which is what publishing houses are there to do. First of all, there is always a drop-off between books. This is obvious. You can only read book 2 if you have read book 1. You can only read book 3 if you've read book 1 and 2. So as the series gets longer and longer, it loses its potential reader base. So instead of working on a 10-book series and slowly having the readership fall off, instead write a trilogy, then start a new trilogy, or write a 4-book series, or a standalone, or a duology. It just makes a lot more sense from a money standpoint. However, to this point, I do think this is why we're also seeing a lot of different entries into wider series, a bit like Sanderson's Cosmere or Realm of the Elderlings. We have a trilogy, but then we have another trilogy that's in the same world, and it has cameos from some of the characters, or series that follow the main character's children, doing something like what Joanne Abercrombie's currently doing, or currently done in the past. Just recently we had Richard Swan say that he's working on a sequel series to his Empire of the Wolf trilogy, so I do think we will probably see more and more of that popping up in trad publishing. Also, so many people in the industry are saying the production costs have gone up, especially because of the events in recent years, which means that they're either going to take a hit in profits or they're going to have to charge more, which means less people will pick it up, potentially. Especially once you get into the big chonker category, where it's going to cost more to print this than it is to print this. The other thing is production time. So even just writing something, I'm going to pick it back up again. Writing something like this is obviously going to take a lot longer than writing a shorter novel, which means less releases in the same time frame, which then equals less money. So the point of all this is, yes, it's very hard to get the information and insider information because it is just so multifaceted. You can see why publishers would be pushing for shorter epic fantasy series. So you might be thinking, Andrew, that sounds like epic fantasy really is dying. But I just don't think this is the case for a number of reasons. First of all, I think Matt over at Matt's Fantasy Books made a really good point when he said,
debut authors almost never get multi-book epic fantasy deals. Publishing houses rarely ever penned long deals in the first place. They penned shorter contracts and went from there.
Very few authors are brought on to write huge epic fantasy series. Most of the time they're brought on as a couple book deal, and then they're able to increase that once they prove that their books are doing well. For example, Malazan Guardians of the Moon, that was meant to be a standalone, turned out to be Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is its huge 10-book plus series. The second point is more of a theory I have about the industry that I am going to call the Slingshot Theory. And the Slingshot Theory says, if there is a sudden trend that moves an industry one way and we start getting a lot within that certain area, there will then be a demand for the opposite. And I do think that we have already seen this play out in the publishing industry. We had a lot of grimdark books, and then suddenly, cozy fantasy blew up. Even the origin story to Legends and Lattes leans into this idea. Travis Baldree wrote Legends and Lattes after just being really burnt out with all these really depressing grimdark books, and he just wanted to write something a wee bit more fun, a wee bit more uplifting, a wee bit more cozy, and cozy fantasy then blew up. Does this mean the grimdark is dead? no, we're still getting grimdark books. I do think then we might slingshot the other way and get a lot more grimdark books down the line after cozy fantasy's kind of had its time in the spotlight. And I do think that shorter fantasy books will be the same situation. If we get a lot more shorter 350 to 500 page fantasy books and trilogies rather than longer series, there will then become a demand for longer fantasy books and for longer fantasy series. Slingshot theory, absence creates demand. And a lot of the other videos on this topic have already said it. However, I do want to reiterate the point that indie is huge right now. It's becoming more and more popular for authors to publish through indie publishing or even hybrid publishing. There's a lot of trad authors that are doing some indie stuff. We have some indie authors that are moving into trad. It is becoming a lot more fluid, and the ability to publish books yourself and the quality of the books you're able to put out yourself as an author has become a lot higher in recent years, with there becoming more and more incredible freelance editors that you can hire to read over your work, the accessibility for beta readers and ARC readers, using all the different facets that we now have with social media and different websites, as well as artists that are taking commissions and working freelance completely online that you can just hire to create some of the most beautiful fantasy covers you have ever seen. Indie is really killing it with fantasy covers. And even print quality is getting to the point where it's indistinguishable from trad publishing. And within this indie space, authors are free to kind of do whatever they want, which is great. It means that there are no guidelines from the publishers that say that they have to write within a certain word count, which again, we don't know is happening or not. There is conflicting reports, or that they want a specific book put out. Instead, authors can just write what they are passionate about. So is long epic fantasy dying? No. Is long epic fantasy currently going out of trend? Maybe for a short while? What does this mean as a reader? Very little. This is the thing, fantasy is so big right now, we have so many different branches, the epic fantasy can be found in so many different ways that it really will make no difference to readers. And if you are specifically looking for a long epic fantasy series, there are tons coming out in the indie space as well in the meantime. What does this mean for authors? Very, very little. If you're an author and you're writing a book, you shouldn't care too much about word count. If you find an agent that loves your work, they're not going to not take it because it's too long. They're just not. It just won't happen. Perhaps they'll say it needs to be trimmed down, or perhaps they'll say it needs to be bulked up. But if they find a good writer, they're going to work with you. And passion will always come through and trump trying to write to a recent trend. And that being said, even if all this was true, and again, it's speculation, no one really has the numbers or all the inside information because there are conflicting reports. If we start getting a bunch of shorter fantasy books, and you write the best long epic fantasy book one in a 10-book series, and it's really, really strong, and an editor finds it and really likes it, and they go to publish it, it will stand out. People will flock to it and will slingshot back to that. You might be the book that throws us back into long epic fantasy books. So write what you're passionate about. So these are just some of my thoughts on the question, is epic fantasy dying? I do think this is a really interesting topic, so I will leave some of the other videos I watched in the description below. Please go watch them and make up your own mind, because again, this is all just my opinion, and I am far from an expert. There's a reason that my name is The Fool's Tale. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you very much for watching.